Jeff, James, so great to have you guys on the podcast with me. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, absolutely. Glad to be with you.
So good to be here.
I would love for you guys to tell me a little bit about yourself. Tell me a little bit about, this is a unique thing right here. Father, son, I can't wait to dive into your story, but give us a little bit of your modern day right now context, and then we'll dive back into your story.
Jeff, you go ahead and start.
Dad, you want me first? Okay. This is what happens when you have three people on, right? My name is Geoffrey Banks. I work in student ministries at a church called Port City Community Church. It's a non-denominational church in Wilmington, North Carolina. And I get to work with middle school and high school students, creating, I work a lot on our teaching content and care for our students, pastoral care, when they're navigating tough things. I've been here I'm in my 6th year, and love what I get to do with students here.
And I'm James Banks. I'm the founding pastor of Peace Church in Durham, North Carolina, and I'm a writer for Our Daily Bread, and love to father of 2 kids, 2 grandkids, and love to encourage people who are going through challenging times in their families, and love to encourage people to pray.
It's awesome. Well, guys, I'm a parent as well. I've got 3 kids, 9, 8, and 3, and this is so just in season of this conversation is for the things that my wife and I are praying for in terms of for our kids, and also the fears that we wrestle with. And so why don't you dive back and talk a little bit about your story, because I know there are so many people who are listening to this. We've had so many questions about this topic, and then we'll just dig into where God's showing up in your story.
Sounds good. Jeff, again, you wanna lead into that?
Sure. Sorry, I never know where to start, but so we moved to Durham, North Carolina. I was about 5 years old at the time, and my dad was pastoring at this point at a different church than the one he later planted. I grew up kind of in, with everything you could ever wanted. Whenever I think back about my childhood, whenever you hear stories like mine, I think a lot of people are used to hearing lots of trauma in the childhood or lots of crazy stuff going on that led them to do the things that they did. And, my story is kind of an exception to what sometimes feels like a rule, I guess. I look back on my childhood fondly, and everything was great. I made good grades. Everybody liked me. But I do think, as I was one of those kids that everyone encouraged and thought, oh, you're going to do great things. I think I kind of became addicted to that sort of acceptance and that sort of encouragement, and started dying for other people's approval in some ways. And, as I got older and went into middle school, my desires for approval kind of shifted from, I think whenever you're in elementary school, you want your parents and your teachers to think that you're the greatest in the world. But then as you get older, you're like, oh, I don't really care about that so much anymore. I want my friends to think this. And as this kind of transition is happening, I grew up in the church. Obviously, my dad's a pastor, and, believed in God as a kid, would have told you I was a Christian as a kid. But for whatever reason, and I still haven't been able to put my finger on why this is, I didn't understand. I didn't make the jump between having faith in something and the way that faith influences how you live. I don't think I ever made that jump for whatever reason. And as a student pastor, most of the time I see kids making that jump in middle school. They start thinking oh, this isn't my parents' faith anymore. Yeah. This is when I start to own my own faith, So during that space, during that time where I really probably should have been doing that, I was being introduced to the world of drugs, and I kind of, stumbled upon it through friend groups, and my sister was dabbling at the time, and I remember, smoking weed for the first time. I think I was in 7th grade, and I remember my mind being blown. I thought it was the greatest thing in the world, and honestly, like this huge curiosity arose in me. And I'm a very curious person. I'm a skeptic. I like to ask lots of questions. I don't take anyone's word at face value. Like, I have to question and wrestle and press. And so I had heard things about drugs and how bad they were and how it was going to ruin your life and all these things, but I didn't really believe them. And hand in hand with that, I've kind of always been like a rebel, and I still have this streak in me. I don't know that. I think it's the way God created me. It's well, let's blame it on Him.
It's called a maverick now. That's the reformed, redeemed descriptor right there. You're a maverick.
Right. There we go. I'll take it. Jesus was too, right?
That's right.
But yeah, so I started, I got this curiosity surrounding drugs, and I remember, staying up all night, like on blogs and stuff, like reading about different drugs and what they can make you feel like. And I had this obsession with it. Like, my brain just latched on to like really this like exploration and how I could feel and, all these things. So that led me down a path that spiraled pretty quickly. It changed from like this almost like childlike curiosity that like, and I don't ever think curiosity is a bad thing. Like, I don't think that was a bad thing about me.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, I don't know. I was a kid. I was curious, and I didn't really have a ton of places to get my questions about it answered. So I just made myself elaborate. And eventually I stumbled upon opiates. I went in a friend's parent had passed away from cancer, and they had a cabinet full of pain meds. And I remember going through this cabinet and like typing things into Google, like, what is this? What is this? What is this? And finding a bottle of Oxycontin and a bottle of Percocets. And that was kind of where my love for opiates was shaped. Like, I immediately, like the first time I did it, I knew, I was like, this is what I want to feel like all the time. And meanwhile, my dad at home, like, I think for a little bit, like, they didn't really know anything was going on. And Dad, I'll let you speak to this a little bit, but as time went on, it started to become very clear that I was struggling with substances.
Yeah, that's right. And Jeff was that kid growing up that everyone liked. I have this memory of walking into a mini mart with him, and there was this store owner who sees him, never seen him before, and it's like he's a long lost friend. And I realized early on that's kind of a gift that God put on him. He's very likable by nature, but the truth is that ended up pulling him in some directions that were difficult. When his sister went down a certain path, all of a sudden it became apparent. Oh, you have a little brother, and Jeff, in many ways, had a great childhood. Certainly we made plenty of mistakes at home, but before Jeff even left the hospital, we held him in our arms. We gave him to God. We prayed that God would bless him and that Jesus would save him and be in his life. And so that's the kind of home that he was raised in. And the challenge along the way, as you know better than I, as a church planter, sometimes a friend told me once that being a church planter is like putting a target on your back and saying to the devil, "Come get me."
Yeah.
And we felt that when he couldn't go after us in certain ways, though he definitely tried, he really went after our kids. And some of that was targeted in such a way that I was just not prepared for it at all, because we always tend to see our kids in some ways as extensions of ourselves. And I was that kid in high school who was an overachiever. I was California state champion in informative speaking my senior year in high school and all that stuff. And so, of course, my son's going to follow the same road, And when he starts to make choices that I just could not conceive of, my response is legalistic. It's harsh. It's overly personal at times. And Jeff, sometimes I wonder about that relational aspect. If I was so busy putting out fires, saying, "Don't do this. This isn't going to get you. God doesn't approve of that." the relational aspect wasn't something that, we could put forward enough at home. And I think that may have contributed. I don't know, God alone knows. But at the same time, we know that God was at work in all of this in ways that are so far beyond us to, accomplish things that would end up helping a lot of people. But we walked with Jeff through a very difficult road, a road also where we had to look at mistakes we had made, and at the same time where there was this incredible discovery of God's goodness and presence. There were like these, best way to put it are these Jacob moments where, the Lord was in this place and I didn't know it. And, I don't say that as trying to overly spiritualize it. It's this genuine presence of Jesus who met us with peace and calm in some of the most unthinkable places. And
wow.
So,
Yeah. And when I think about that relational aspect, if you're listening and you're the parent of a teenager or a student or even someone that struggles with substances, one of the things I do remember kind of happening is like, and I don't think this was just what was happening at home. I think this was a combination of the DARE program that I was going through at school and just the modern, and I don't know how far we want to go down that road, but the modern kind of conceptualization of drugs and substances. And I just remember like being told, like, oh my gosh, if you do this, it's gonna ruin your life. Your life is gonna fall apart. Yeah. All these things are gonna happen. You're gonna end up in jail. And then what happens is you go try them, or you have friends that are doing it, and that's not happening to anyone, or very, very few people is that happening to in 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th grade as they begin to experiment. Like those things are few and far between. So what I remember happening is hearing at home, like, oh my gosh, these things are so dangerous. Like you can't do these things. They're going to, take you down this path. And I remember hearing at school, like these things will ruin your life. You'll become addicted. And then I remember looking at my friends and going, that's not what's happening to them. They seem like they're having a good time. Like they're fine. We're having fun together. It almost seemed innocent in a sense. Like it was like my life's not falling apart. Like, so that means in my head, like, oh, you don't necessarily know what you're talking about, And I kind of remember that happening. Like you don't. That's not true. And in the long run, it was true. But kids are short-sighted, and I think you hold up what you see at school and what you see in your friend groups against what you hear. And, you're going to usually for a student, especially a teenager, like you're going to listen to this a lot, to your friends a lot. And so I remember thinking like, oh, they've got it wrong, And I genuinely had this like thought in my head. And I think a lot of us do this with difficult situations. Like if you have like a sin pattern or a struggle in your life or something that, you wish you could stop. Like I think a lot of us have this like conception of like, oh, well, one day, we tell ourselves like these one day stories, like one day I thought like I would one day like get a job, graduate from college, have a family, get married, and just stop doing drugs magically. Like that one day it would just, my difficult situation would just resolve itself and I wasn't really going to have to try or change anything or push or anything. Like I thought it would just happen. I thought that's how everybody's life worked, and I think in lots of ways that's the narrative we're kind of sold on, like by society. Like, oh, you go to college and you party and you live this lifestyle, and then you graduate and you get a job and you're good. Yeah. And for some people that's true, but for me it wasn't. So I was in middle school. I discovered these opiates, and slowly but surely they began to kind of take over my life. It went from I do this every now and again thing to I do this every day thing. I played sports. I was captain of the lacrosse team. I loved getting to play sports. Loved getting to hang out with friends. Like had healthy habits. I fenced. Which who fences? I fence. But yeah,
that's pretty awesome. I'm not gonna lie, fencing.
It's so fun. It's so fun.
I know, right? That's awesome.
But my, those positive things in my life started to get put to the wayside because I was spending so much time seeking drugs. And my opiate addiction got worse and worse and worse. It stopped becoming easy to hide. You know, my parents would find, you know, it's like, I don't know, like pills in my pocket or cigarettes or weed or whatever. And, you know, it kind of became pretty clear pretty quickly that like there was more going on than just this like innocent experimentation.
Right. Wow.
And I would bring it to school. You know, I'd bring drugs to school. I was selling drugs at this point, and I started to get in legal trouble. Like, I remember getting arrested. I was at school. I was 16 years old, and got arrested for having weed with me at school. And they charged me as an adult because I was on school campus. I was 16 years old, and I remember going to the county jail as a 16-year-old kid. And I don't know if this was like a scared straight thing or what they were thinking, but I remember that being the first time that I was like, oh, this is real life, you know, like, but it didn't really stop me. You know, I thought I was unlucky. I thought I got caught. And my parents, you know, and Dad, maybe you can speak more to this season, but you guys were doing whatever you could to help me. And I was full on addicted to opiates, stealing. It was crazy, crazy life.
Yeah. Meanwhile, Mom and Dad are trying to figure out what exactly is going on. We know, you know, a lot of things aren't right, but at the same time, if you have someone in your life who's an addict, they can be really good manipulators. And Jeff takes that to another level. I mean, he, you know, just because of his social skills, you know, was able sometimes to sort of wend his way through some stuff. And so we did the best that we could. You know, we realized, things are not going on the way they should. So we tried to do things like remember a keylogger on your computer, and you know, trackers on phones and cars, and you know, we're asking friends to pray and pray. And I remember something that happened one day. I will never forget this, but there was a group of pastors that I was meeting with, and shared with them some of what was going on. And after the meeting, one of them pulls me aside and says, "James, I'm sorry." And I said, "Why? Why are you sorry?" He said, "Well, I kind of feel guilty." He said, "Because I know you, and I know the way you've raised your kids." And then he looked at me and he said, "And the truth is, kids make their own choices." And I could have hugged him because, you know, honestly, when you're a parent, you're going through all this, you know, you tend to have, I hate to sum it up with a bumper sticker, but, you know, my child is an honor student at, you know, and we tend to make these comparisons with other parents, and it's immediately, where did I go wrong? Right. You know, how could I have done something differently? And of course, you know, there's always just enough there where we can look at ourselves and say, yeah, I know I could do better. But at the same time, you know, there's all this going on in our kids' lives, spiritually, psychologically, socially, that we don't have a grasp on, and so we're, you know, desperately trying to get there. And this is where it became a place where the beautiful thing that came out of this was that God drove us to our knees again and again, and you know, caused us to pray in a way that was just this, you know, call for help. And you know, my wife and I began to do certain things like fasting together on like a Thursday afternoon. You know, we'd skip a meal at lunch, that kind of thing, as we're praying for our kids. And meanwhile, there are other things going on with Jeff's sister at the time. And, you know, it just feels like things are unraveling. And yet, as we're just in that place of, you know, clinging to God as best we can, you know, we find that somehow He gets us through. But at the same time, I should also add that, you know, one of the good things about the Lord walking with us in this time was that it helped us in our own relationship, because you know, Jeff, I think it's pretty safe to say that your mom was the good cop and I was the bad cop, as you were going through this. I mean, uh, my wife,
Sure.
we have substance abuse on both sides of the family if you go back far enough. But my wife's dad was an alcoholic, and so sometimes he was on, he was sharp, he was great. Other times he was just really, dissipated. And he was still her dad. And so she wasn't judging him solely on his actions. She just knew how to love him. And that was something that I was having to learn, and learn very quickly as we were encountering this territory with my kids. So I think that she did it, kind of more naturally, but that also meant for tension sometimes in our relationship. It's like, well, why are you allowing this, or why are you saying this? And so, again, having to work all this through, we needed that common ground of faith and the strength that God's Spirit pours into each of us to be able to say, I'm sorry I messed up, or I need to regroup, I need to be more understanding. So again, a lot going on a lot of different levels.
Wow. This is hitting me really in season right now, guys. I know I said that already, but especially the spiritual warfare aspect and engaging in the spiritual warfare that you're referring to right here, because our entire culture sets up this construct that says, you put this effort forward, you're gonna get this result, right? It's a 1 + 1 = 2, and it becomes a very self-sufficient thing, and that trickles over into every area of our life. But it can, as you're saying, it can bleed over into parenting and thinking that, well, okay, if I do these right things, then my kids are going to turn out right. It's just 1 + 1 = 2. Everything should be fine. And so then we begin to gauge our own ability or inability based on the outcome of what our kids are doing. And, I've got one child who's struggling particularly right now with some poor choices. And, they're young enough right now that we're really trying to correct this behavior now. And yet at the same time, I'm feeling very convicted by what you're saying about the relational aspect, that there's so much of a bedrock of relationship that needs to be focused on, not instead of, the training and the discipline, but also like, as a undergirding, as a foundation for that. Yeah. And yet at the same time, there are going to be battles that we cannot fight. And it's going to drive, as you said, James, going to drive us to our knees. And there are things that it's almost like the Lord is continually trying to draw us all to this place of going, hey, listen, like this whole faith thing is an actual dependence on me. Like not just an acknowledgement dependence on me. Like, I depend on the Lord, but I've got all of this stuff taken care of, and I'm going to line my ducks up in a row, and I'm going to produce this particular outcome for myself. But it's, Lord, I don't know what to do in this situation. Mm-hmm. I really, really, really need you. Yeah. And I wonder if you can speak a little bit, maybe even lean into that a little bit more, either one of you guys, maybe where you were feeling it, Jeff, maybe where you guys were engaging in it, that spiritual warfare aspect where you're trusting, you're coming to this place where you're trusting the Lord to go, we don't really know what to do right here. We're going to have to rely on you, Lord. And then, Jeff, what that was doing maybe for you as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jeff, why don't you share a little more about where your story led, and because I think that really leads into this aspect.
Yeah, so that, like, for me, the spiritual side of things didn't really come, at least I should say on the surface, didn't really come till much later. Underneath the surface, I still would have, through, like, in the midst of my addiction, I still would have told you I was a Christian, still would have told you I believed in God, like, that didn't really go out the window for me. Again, I just never made the jump between, like, oh, this faith should actually inform my life, which to me now, like, sounds dumb, but whenever I honestly think about it, it's like, that's how lots of us live. We do church on Sunday like we do baseball practice. This is just what you do. And it only really matters when you have the big game. You know what I mean? Like, and in our heads, that's whenever you die and you get into heaven or hell, but it's like,
well, and especially, I'll just say this too, because we have listeners from all over the globe. especially in the region of the United States that you guys are living in.
Yep.
I grew up in the South. I grew up in Birmingham, went to undergrad in South Carolina, was on staff at a church for a while there in South Carolina. So I get it. My dad still pastors right outside of Asheville, North Carolina. That whole like southeastern region, everyone goes to church. Everyone's a Christian, right? But it's more like a country club kind of Christian culture, right? So anyways, go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, you're right, man. And it's almost like down here, like, and I hate to be like this, but like I wish that I was in a space where like people told me they were Christians. I was like, oh, a brother or sister in Christ. But for me, lots of times, like if someone tells me that, I get skeptical. I'm like, what do you mean? Like, what does that actually mean for you? You know, because for lots of people, it means I show up to a building for an hour on Sunday and look down on other people because I think I'm morally superior.
Yeah.
But anyways, that's a whole nother hour conversation. But yeah, it's very true. So I never made that jump, and I don't think that was the fault of my parents. You know what I mean? I don't think it was the fault of people around me. I think I think I just never. I don't know what it was. Like I said, I still haven't put my finger on it. If I figure that out, we'll have to do another episode. But so I'm there and still struggling with drugs. My faith is kind of there. I was in and out of jail, and my story kind of gets repetitive here. I remember my parents being like, "Hey, you need to get help." I graduated high school. I got into college at a pretty young age, and whenever I went to college, I graduated from pills, like over the counter pharmaceutical pills, to IV heroin. And it was kind of one of those things, you know, where I was like, I had all these like barriers, like, oh, I'll do drugs, but I'll never do this. I'll never do coke. I'll never do meth. I'll never do heroin. And then I just started to knock those barriers down, you know, because you're around it so much, you get desensitized to it so much. And when everyone around you is doing heroin, all of a sudden heroin's not that scary.
Well, and you were selling.
So I end up on IV heroin.
You were selling at the time, right? And then you ran out?
Yeah, that's really how it happened. Is I was selling it to keep up with my pill habit, and then all of a sudden it became pretty enticing to me. So my life, it was already unraveled, but I started to go deeper and deeper and deeper at this point. And I kind of turned to crime to keep up my habit, and it turned into selling drugs and breaking into houses and robbing people and, you know, doing whatever I had to do to kind of get the money that I needed. And people always, you know, you wonder why, if you have a family members or a friend that struggles with addiction, like people often wonder why they do the things they do. And I don't think people realize like the grip that it has on people, where it's like it's on an instinctual level. Like it's not a conscious thought of, oh, it's totally okay for me to rob this store. That's not what happens. And I think sometimes we have this stigma surrounding addiction where we look at people like that and we're like, oh, they're just making bad decisions. Yeah. But on an actual chemical level in your brain, your body begins to think, because of this flood of dopamine that you're getting from drugs, begins to think that it's more important than food or water, and you need it to survive, so you're willing to do anything. And so I start to do all these things that I would never do. I start to, you know, whenever you get into heroin, you also get the risks of overdoses and you know, needle use and all the things that come with that. And so my risk is starting to go through the roof. I have people around me overdosing, guns, crime, all that stuff. So I finally get, you know, to.
You were sharing needles at one point.
Go ahead.
You were sharing needles at one point as well.
Wow. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I would do whatever I had to do. You know, my friend was giving me a hard time the other day because I think I ate a piece of food off the ground. He was like, "Dude, what's wrong with you?" And I'm like, "Man, I used to shoot up with toilet water. Like eating a chicken nugget off the ground is like the height of sanitation for me." Wow. But so I say that laughing. It's not funny, but like it's crazy to think about, you know, where I used to be. And but anyways, so. My life starts to unravel. I got arrested for having an illegal gun, and I remember my parents came to see me in jail, and they were like, "Hey, like you know," and they had been through a lot at this point. They're like, "We want to help you, but we're not going to bail you out unless you go to rehab." And I went to rehab for the first time, actually where I live now in Wilmington, North Carolina, and it didn't last very long. I got out, and then I started using again pretty quickly. And moved to Nashville, and I want to kind of sum my story up. And this is in Nashville. I went to rehab there. I was good for a little bit. I was sober for a little bit. And then I again went down that path, and I kind of lied to myself, like, oh, I can just use here and there, like I can just do heroin on the weekends, which nobody does heroin on the weekends, but that's what I thought. And I would just end up straight back in my addiction. And I am in and out of rehabs. Finally went for a time that was really impactful, and I was really happy, and I was sober, and I didn't really have a relationship with God, but I was in a 12-step program and was doing pretty well. I went to church here and there, and got in a really bad relationship. And it was bad because of me, not the person that I was with. I was just a very toxic person at this time, and I relapsed, and I took her money and her car. And this is kind of the rock bottom of my story. Is she didn't really know what was going on, that I'd relapsed, and I would steal her money. And I took some of her money, and I took her car out. I went to my dealer's house. I got my drugs, and I was driving back home, and I pulled off on the side of the road to use some of the drugs. And I remember putting the needle in my arm and injecting the heroin and pulling back onto the road and sped up to like 50, 60 miles per hour. I was on the highway, and I passed out behind the wheel, overdosed, and hit a power pole. And that was kind of my like rock bottom moment. I think we talk about that a lot, but that was kind of the moment where I realized, like, man, I'm going to die or stop. And I wasn't sure which one I wanted, if I'm being real. Like, I could not imagine life without drugs. Like, it was like my best friend. It was my comfort. It was the thing that was always there for me. So to think to live without it was unimaginable. And I went to rehab for the last time, and I remember kind of having these plans of like what I was gonna, like, here's how I can recover. And I really did want to get sober at this point. Like, I didn't want to keep living the way that I was. Like, I wanted something to change. I just didn't know how. And I remember kind of telling my parents my plan, and they were like, we've done your plan 1,000 times. And I think this was my 10th rehab at this point.
Wow.
And they're like, we're not doing your plan again. And they found this place called Christian Recovery Houses here in Bloomington, North Carolina. And they were like, if you go there, we'll help you out. And I really didn't want anything to do with Jesus, anything. Like, I had met Christians. I wasn't crazy about Christians. I had this conception of Jesus, again, living in the Bible Belt. I was in Nashville, Tennessee at this point, which is kind of the height of Christendom in some places.
The buckle on the Bible Belt.
But
It is.
Yeah. So I had this conceptualization of following Jesus that was like, following Jesus means, I don't know, like having your shirt tucked in and judging these people and listening to this music and looking down on those people and voting for these people. And like, I had this like cookie cutter picture of what it meant to be Christian in my head. And I knew that I didn't want to be that, So I go to this recovery house, and at first I was kind of starting to confirm everything that I thought. And I had to go to this church if I lived there, called Port City. And I remember showing up to Port City wanting to confirm everything that I thought about Christians. And I remember kind of pulling up in the driveway and, or in the parking lot, and smoking a cigarette and putting it out on the door and flicking it in the bushes. And like, I was just a jerk. And I wanted everyone to be like, what's wrong with you? Like, you need to get your crap together. You can't be here. So that I could be like, oh, that's exactly what Christians are like. But they didn't. They were like, oh, that's fine, man. If that's how you want to act, like, whatever. We still love you. Like, you can still be here. You can still spend time with us. We still want to know your name. We still want to learn about you. Like, that's not going to put us off. And that was weird to me. I remember that being really weird. But I stuck around, and I started to get to know people. And I didn't really meet like my people or a friend. Like, I was the youngest person in the room all the time. I was 21, 22 at the time. And didn't feel like I had my person. And then this guy named Daniel moved into the halfway house, and Daniel had a great relationship with Jesus. He had been an intern at a church for a while, but he had a past an addiction, and he had relapsed, and he had come to the house, but his faith was still kind of strong and intact. And I remember having all these questions and all these things that I felt like I couldn't ask or voice, and he was kind of one of the first people who was like, oh, dude, those are great questions. Like, let's totally talk about, why I believe in Jesus, or, what, I don't know, how old the earth is, or whatever your, big questions are. So he wasn't afraid of those questions. He was excited to explore them. And through that relationship and through being at this church, like, I remember looking back at one point and going, oh my gosh, it's been 9 months since I've done any drugs. It's been 9 months since I've even like wanted to do drugs. Wow. And that was the moment that I was like, Oh, there's more to the story going on here. Like there's
Wow.
something real here. Like because that was a miracle for me to not want to do drugs
Yeah.
and to be happy and okay living without them. And man, I should be dead. Like and whenever I think about the spiritual warfare aspect, like I look back and I have so many friends that are dead, so many friends that are in prison, so many people that like sometimes I almost end up with like survivor's guilt,
Yeah.
of like why me? Like why am I still here?
Yeah.
But I look back at some of the differences and the things that I always see is like having people praying for me, thinking of my parents praying for me at home and loving me well, having people that relentlessly loved me and wouldn't turn their back on me no matter what, and having a community of people around me that walked with me, a positive community, and that changed everything for me. And those are the things that I saw God use again and again and again in my life to turn things around. And there's 1,000 stories along the way of how that happened and what it looked like. And, maybe my dad can share
Yeah.
some of those.
There's so much ground to cover in this, but
The Nothing is Wasted content library of resources and podcast episodes are made possible by our growing community of members. If you would like to be a part of having a global impact and help people partner with God to take back their stories, consider joining Community Plus for just $20 a month. Your membership comes with access to a course called Position for Redemption, masterclasses taught by our certified coaches, bonus podcast episodes, and Q&As with myself and some of our other special guests. You can get more information and sign up at nothingiswasted.com/community. I look forward to connecting with you further within our Community Plus platform.
the whole aspect of loving well is key. And this is where, if you were to sum up, we really have to get our love from God because, and I know that sounds too easy and it sounds, again, like I'm overly spiritualizing it.
Yeah, until you're in a situation where you need it, you absolutely need it, right? Like it sounds like the spiritual answer, James, but you're going,
Yeah.
we find ourselves in these situations where we're like, I don't have the capability of
Exactly.
loving when I'm continually getting betrayed, hurt,
Exactly,
Yeah.
David. I mean, here we are in a situation where, Jeff is in and out of rehab. We had to homeschool him to get him through high school. He had gotten kicked out of, the same school a couple of times. Then he went to the continuation school, ended up getting kicked out of there for selling, and finally to get him through high school, we homeschool him. And, then these things are going on where he starts college, he seems to be doing okay, but then burns through his college money with the drugs. And, some parents, I think at that point would just be kind of like, we're done, you blew it. And we have this expression that you often hear about, love must be tough. And one of the things that we learned along the way is that love has to be tough on us as well. In other words, if we're going to really follow Jesus in our relationship with our son, that means we've got to love him like Jesus does, and that sometimes means going places where we don't want to go and doing things that are going to cost us money that we would have rather have spent on other things. And that doesn't mean that we don't have boundaries. We definitely do have those boundaries. But Jeff, I think about when you went to Christian Recovery House, CRH, and it was this situation where Jeff had been in and out of rehab, like you said, 10 times at that point. And this has been going on for like 7 years. And we have this meeting. All the other rehab situations he'd done, some of them had been very good, but there was that faith-based element that we were trying to find where there was genuinely a relational aspect. And again, this goes back to what we were talking about with prayer earlier, where prayer is more than just this input-output. It's got to be relational, or what are we doing? And so we find this place, and we go have this initial meeting. And as soon as we're wrapping up the meeting, Elizabeth, the lady who interviewed us, says, "Can we pray?" And as soon as she prays, it's like, oh, this is where we're supposed to be. I mean, it wasn't just this pro forma kind of thing. You knew God was at work in it. But
Right.
as soon as we get out in the car, Jeff turns to us and says, "I'm not going to Jesus camp." And it's on.
Jeff, I don't know you very well, but that sounds like something you would have said.
I mean, it's on from that point. We are traveling just like 3 miles back to his sister's house, and the argument gets so heated in the car on the way there that I have to pull over at this McDonald's because I cannot drive anymore. I'm just absolutely, at the end of this. And a lot of this, there are things behind the scenes. We're exhausted physically because Jeff had just been through detox, and we had gone to Nashville. We had loaded up this moving van, and at first he was kind of okay with it, but then we get to the outskirts of Nashville, and he's just, "Oh, please!" We're in this public restaurant. We stop, and have a bite to eat, and he's like pleading with us, "No, don't go," and he's in tears, and we're kind of making this scene, and we're driving. We finally managed to get back into the U-Haul and get on the highway. As I'm driving back, I'm realizing, wow, this is like one of the lowest moments of my life, because this just hurts so bad. And how do we, how do we get through this? So, we're all emotionally frazzled at this moment when Jeff is like, "I'm not going to Jesus camp." Just a couple of days later, and our daughter's boyfriend talks him into it and basically says, "Hey, just do it to make him happy. I mean, just, you can do anything for a few days." And he was this Iraq War veteran, so he had, this good perspective.
Yeah.
And so Jeff goes, and eventually, he's in with this group, and Jeff, you've summed it up before. This group of people who basically their approach was, "Dude, just come to Jesus. We'll figure the rest out later." And there was a spirit about them that I think I had been trying to communicate to my son in terms of knowing Jesus is just such a good thing, but he was, how that is, you say something over and over again. And of course, there were times where I preached a lot of sermons to Jeff that I really shouldn't have, because they were harsh and in anger. And yet, here's this, suddenly he starts to see it. And I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Hook before, but parents who have addicts can relate to this. Here's this Peter Pan character, and nobody recognizes him back in Neverland until this little boy kind of takes his face in his hands and reshapes it and says, "Oh, there you are, Peter." And that was what we started to see with our son. When he'd go through rehab, it was like, "Oh, there you are. There you are." These substances are losing their effect, and there's the boy that we loved and raised, and there you are. And so we began to see this slow redemptive work of God, and it was a slow work. I mean, that's, I think, important to point out, because some people expect it to be this sort of overnight, redemptive story. But it ended up becoming this beautiful thing that God did in our son's life. And not only that, and Jeff's gifts began to be recognized at the church, and he starts to volunteer in places, and eventually he's on staff there. And the church had this culture, and I think that's really important as well. We want our churches to have that culture of Jesus was a friend of sinners, and so often I think that's not the case. We were blessed in our church Likewise, up at Peace, where there were people who had prodigals, they'd been that road. And so they knew how to pray with us and for us. And I cannot underscore enough how important that is. And also, just one more thing to the spiritual warfare aspect. We also did whatever we could to get the Word of God into our son's life. And as we were praying and as we were, doing things like giving him books like, Scripture Promises for Your Every Need, or whatever the title may be, we began to see God do things that would let just enough light in so that we realized we're on the right road. It's dark, we got to keep going, but this is where we go. It's a lamp to our feet, I mean, sometimes it's just the foot level. But Jeff has a particular story about a book of verses that we gave him one night if we have time, I'd love to have him just share that briefly, because I think it speaks into this whole spiritual warfare aspect of, loving those who are far from God and often far from us. Jeff, you want to...
Yeah, and I want to make sure that there's time for you to ask any questions you want to ask, Davey.
Oh man, you guys this is great. Like, I feel like you're answering any questions that are arising. I've got a couple, but you're as you're telling this, man, I'm like, this is amazing what you got. Just this back and forth, this dynamic that has happened in your story between parent, son. It's incredible.
Sweet. Well, so the story that he's talking about, I was in treatment, and it wasn't the last time. It was, I don't know, probably the 7th or 8th time, and I wish they had like a frequent visitors card where you get the 10th visit free, but
So do I.
But I was, but I feel like with that, I feel like it is important to say here really quickly that. I always recognize that my story in many ways is a story of privilege. Like, I had the privilege to go to treatment. I had the privilege to get access to medical help. I had the privilege to have counselors, and I had access to those things that not everyone does.
Yeah.
And
can I stop you right there, Jeff? I feel really prompted, because when you've walked a redemptive journey, your story is a story of privilege.
Yeah.
And the Lord does that. So that your eyes open up and you can scan the landscape and go, there's a lot of people who don't have access to this. Mm-hmm. And the Lord goes, that's why I gave this to you, so that you can steward this to help those who don't have it. And I feel that's the exact reason I'm sitting here with a microphone right now. It's like, man, people wrap their arms around, like, it was such a public thing, my story was. And so everybody rushed in and helped me. And then as I go around and share my story, I go, why doesn't everybody else have access to it the way I did?
Right.
And the Lord's going, that's why I gave it to you, because I want you to give access to everybody. I want you to be that person for everybody that opens up the door. And so I just want to speak that into you if you haven't seen that yet, Jeff, because I think you have. I think that's because I'm sensing that is a lot of the thread of the ministry that you do. But, man, that just occurred to me right there as you're saying that.
Oh, man, that's so good. Thank you so much. That is a good word, and I think that's the truth of it. I even think about scripture, like, you see all this language of like chosen, God's chosen people. Yeah. And the question is like, chosen to do what? Right. And it's chosen to take the good news, chosen to take the gospel, chosen to take love to the rest of the world. Yeah. And I think that is, what I've been privileged and grateful to do with my story. And it is easy to see those spaces where you're like, man, like, But you almost feel guilty about it too. But it's beautiful to see the way that God uses it. But I got to go to treatment. I had all these things. I'm in treatment this one time, and I was detoxing. And I don't know how much people know about opiate or heroin withdrawal, but it is the worst of the worst. Jeez. It's like, they say alcohol can actually kill you when you withdraw from it. Opiates, you just want to die, is kind of what people say. Wow. But it's like the worst flu you ever had, and your skin's crawling, and you can't stop moving, and you're hot, but you're cold, and it's the worst. So I couldn't sleep this one night. It was like, I don't know, probably 2:00 in the morning. I'm like walking around the campus of this rehab, just like chain smoking cigarettes, because it's the only thing that would make me feel better for a little bit.
Wow.
And there was like this little chapel on the campus there, and the story around that chapel, and I don't know if it's true or not, but this rehab was in Nashville, and apparently Johnny Cash had been there several times, and the story is that Johnny Cash paid to have this chapel built, which is kind of cool. But I was in this chapel, and I had this little book that my parents had given me at Easter called God's Promises for Your Every Need. And it was like one of those books that's like verses for when you're happy, verses when you're sad, verses for when you're feeling whatever you're feeling. And you know, I'm not crazy about using scripture that way now, but God really used it in my life at that point. So I flipped open, I found there was a chapter, it's like God's promises for when you're suffering. I remember turning open the chapter, and Isaiah 43:2 was on there, and it's when you pass through the waters, I'll be with you, and when you go through the flames, they will not consume you, and when the rivers go over you, won't be swept away, for I am the Lord your God. And I remember, like, in that moment, God speaking to me, and I thought God left me. I thought God, like, if there was a God, he was a bad person. Like, I thought all these things, and in that moment, I just remember God being like, no, I've been here. Like, I've been here alongside you the whole way, and like, it's kind of the only reason you're standing here today is because of that. And I remember it being like, it wasn't like the light bulb moment. None of my walk with Jesus was the overnight altar call moment where everything was perfect the next day. Like, I love those stories. I think they're amazing. I don't want to demean those stories. They're incredible. I'm very jealous of those stories because my story felt a lot like a long trudge. And I think that's most people's stories, like this long trudge towards the cross that it's not pretty, it's not miraculous, it's ugly, it's painful, it's hard. And God works through it anyways. And that in and of itself is kind of miraculous, but it's not like what we think. You know what I mean? It's not what we think.
It's not sensational like we think. Yep.
Right. So that just kind of opened me up to the idea of like Jesus being something that could help me. And then, you know, fast forward, I think my dad said this a little bit, but, you know, to wrap up my story to where I am today is, you know, I'm at this church and I'd been there for years and my talents and gifts are starting to come back. I'm doing good at school. Like, I'm like, oh, I can actually do something with my life, which was new to me. And I was starting to figure out what I wanted to do. And I just felt God pulling me towards ministry, and the church I was at gave me opportunity after opportunity to learn and to teach and to be discipled. And as that happened, like, it became more and more clear, like, oh, this is where I'm supposed to be. And I always thought I would work in addictions ministry, just because oftentimes when you go through something, you're like, oh, that's what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to help people who've been through the exact same thing. But I remember they really needed volunteers in the kids ministry. So I was like, oh, I can do that. Like, I got free time. So I jumped in, and I remember meeting these students, and they were awesome. I loved them. They were amazing. Like, they were so much fun to be around. Yeah. And to me, honestly, it was a miracle they'd let me be around kids. Like, and the first time I tried, they did my criminal background check, and they were like, no, thank you. But then as I got to know them better, they gave me opportunities here and there. And being around those kids, I realized, like, this is where it happened for me. Like, this was the age where I started to go the other way, where I started to ask big questions, where I started to experiment with drugs. And I just, like, I poured my time in there as much as I could. And then, very long story short, now I get to do student ministry at the same church who was a huge part of saving my life. And, you know, I don't know if I'd be here today if it wasn't for them. And, you know, I get to pass on the grace that has been given to me to students. And, you know, this generation right now is struggling in so many ways, but is also beautiful in so many ways. Like, it's a hard time to be a student. Like, they have access to so many things. And so many different perspectives and so many different distractions pulling on their brains. And it is a hard time to be a student. And I'm grateful to be where I am, working with the students that I am at the time that I'm doing it in. Because I just see so many similarities of where I was at. But they're also this generation that is so passionate and loving and socially conscious. Like, these kids care more about people who are in hard situations and sometimes feel like I do, and it's beautiful. And I'm encouraged by them and pushed by them. So it's crazy to me that I get to do ministry here, and I love it. And, you know, it's a privilege.
I love that you've kind of connected the root, right? I mean, the genesis of your addiction was at that age, and you said at the beginning of this, it wasn't wasn't that you had any kind of like hard traumatic life, as a lot of people as they resort to drugs or that kind of a lifestyle to cope. You just had this insatiable curiosity, kind of this void that you didn't understand that only the Lord could fill at the time. And now you're getting to speak that over students' lives and help them understand that like, hey man, like this thing that you're feeling, this God-sized void in your heart, can only be filled with one thing. And I've been down that road to try to satisfy it with any other means possible.
Right. And that's the thing that I've noticed is like my addiction story is very, very similar to everyone's sin story. Like it's the same thing. It's this like cramming things, trying to make yourself feel better. And the thing that I, have really realized and tried to press into is lots of times I think whenever we have a sin or a struggle that we're trying to move beyond, we focus so much on stopping the behavior, right? Like we focus so much on stopping the behavior. And whenever I remember being in 12-step programs, things like that, and I love 12-step program. Like it played a huge role in saving my life. But there are, there's struggles with everything. There's struggles with the church, struggles with 12-step program. I remember having to call myself an addict, and I really, really struggled with that idea. I didn't want to be an addict for the rest of my life, But then I read, scripture, and it's like, no, you're a new creation. The old is gone, the new has come. Or take off the old self and put on the new self. And I think lots of times what happens is we get so focused on behavior, I just got to stop looking at porn, or I just got to stop lying to people, or whatever it is, that we focus so much on taking off the old self that we forget to put on the new self. Like we forget to put on our new clothes.
That's right.
So instead of going like, how can I stop this desire from happening? Because the reality is you probably won't. You probably won't stop the desire. You're still going to be tempted. You're still going to feel the desire to do whatever it is sometimes. The question is instead like, how is this exact same thing about me? How is this insatiable curiosity and this rebellious attitude and this tendency to ask questions and this undying need to feel okay and to get affirmation from people? How's that fulfilled in Christ?
That's right.
Because these are things that God created me with, right? So like, they're not mistakes. They're not accident. I've just been trying to fulfill them in all the wrong ways. And I think lots of times we do this. Like we focus on, if your left arm causes you to sin, chop that bad boy off. And we forget that we're supposed to step into a new creation.
Yeah,
and
let him redeem
for
that
me is
left
what
arm.
changed everything.
Come on. Yeah, you guys have both mentioned, well, in your own right, you've mentioned Jacob. You didn't mention it, Jeff, but you mentioned wrestling. It's like deep wrestling. That's kind of part of your personality. You mentioned it, James, Jacob, and that's all I've been thinking about is this identity crisis that Jacob had, right at the fort of Jabbok, where he wrestles with God, and God changes his name, right? Breaks his hip, heals him, blesses him, and then changes his name. And he's a completely different person walking out of there. Everything that defined him as Jacob, right? Deceiver, supplanter, heel grabber, it was now completely new. And he was now Israel, one who on whose behalf God fights, right? That like the one God fights your battle. You don't have to go and fight your battles. You don't have to strive. You don't have to try to pine to get what you want. God will take care of it, right? That was the complete identity shift in Jacob, and I see that same thing in you, where what you're speaking right now, Jeff, is this idea of it's so imperative to understand that you are a new creation, and you don't have to be identified with your past. That doesn't define you anymore. Yeah, and that's so critical, I think, and that is the distinction between a life with Christ and then just a self-help kind of getting out of the pit.
There's a story about that, Davey, that you're so right. This whole identity matter was what ultimately came to be the paradigm shift for Jeff, where he realizes, if anyone is in Christ, is a new creation. The old is gone, the new has come. Yes, I've struggled with addiction, but that's not who I am deep inside. And so, as his parents, because Jeff has been through rehab before, and he's had seasons where he's done better. You kind of go through a form of PTSD where it's like you're waiting for the other shoe to drop. You're used to that phone ringing in the middle of the night or whatever else. And anyhow, one day at Thanksgiving, we were together. It was a year or so later, and I just was kind of wary what's going on with Jeff. And pulled him aside, went out, used the excuse of gassing up our cars. And so we're standing at the gas station and, filling up the tanks and having this conversation. And again, this goes back to the spiritual warfare matter where I look at him and I think, okay, things seem to be going really well, but, is he watching his back? And I looked at him and I said, Jeff, remember, we have an adversary and he's powerful. And Jeff looked at me and said, I know, Dad. He has power, but he has no authority. And at that moment,
Wow.
I knew, yeah, okay, this is, I'm not making this happen.
Okay.
This is God's work
Wow.
in his life, and he realizes the authority of Christ.
Wow.
And that is everything. I mean, it's
That's right.
so, we're also we're in the same city where Jeff is right now, and we're celebrating a special kind of a special anniversary. Jeff, do you want to mention what that is?
That's right.
Yeah. So yesterday was 10 years.
Wow.
The last time I walked into rehab was 10 years ago, which is
Man.
crazy.
Congratulations, man.
Yeah, thank you, man.
Praise
It's
the Lord.
crazy to be in double digits, and I want to be clear about a few things, and the first is like even that 10 years, I think lots of times in sobriety and in recovery from any addiction, like we aim for perfection, and whenever I look at 10 years, I see a whole lot of brokenness and a whole lot of struggles and a whole lot of mistakes, and like I think sometimes we have this like thing about us that's like, oh, if I ever make a mistake, I'm back to square one, 0 years. And I remember I broke my arm and I got surgery and was taking pain meds to get through that surgery, and I remember struggling hardcore with that and sinning like in that, but I, there's a, it's not about like the perfection of you walking forward. It's about how you receive grace whenever that happens. And, I remember going to my community in my small group and being like, hey, this happened. Like, I'm really struggling. And like, we were all in tears, all these grown men in tears. It was great. But, I just remember them praying over me and like just recognizing the grace in that moment. So whenever I count 10 years, I don't count it as perfection. I count it as provision from God, and with the mistakes and with the ugliness. And the other thing is, talking about identity and, the way that Christ resets us, I do want to say that, like, I think the other end of that spectrum, the other mistake that we can make, I think sometimes, like I was talking to someone the other day, and they had I hadn't seen them in a while, and they showed back up at church, and I was like, oh my gosh, so good to see you. Where you been? And they're like, yeah, I relapsed again. And I was like, oh man, I'm so sorry to hear that. Like, I'm glad to see you back. And I was like, are you going to go to treatment or anything? And he goes, no, I've got the best treatment in the world right here, talking about the church and God. And I was like, man, that's true on some level, but like also go to frickin' treatment. Like and I think we do that sometimes. It's like, no, I've got God, so I don't need any external help from anyone at all. And it's like, that's not the way that God works. Like God, he can if he wants to, but he prefers to work through people. He prefers to work through rehab and counselors and all the other things. So like, don't use God as an excuse for your lack of asking for help. Like, go get help. And I want to say that too, because I think it's easy to go, oh, well, God gives me a new identity, so now I'm good. But while that is a part of my story, that new identity was received, and you have to step into it. And stepping into that new identity took treatment and counselors and confession and church and pastors and being real with my community. And I just think, it's easy to like want a miracle and want the miracle to be immediate, this like burning bush, everything's different now moment. But oftentimes it's slow and it takes time. So like if you're someone who's struggling, like seek after God for sure, grow spiritually for sure, but like also go to counseling, also go to treatment. Like if you had, I don't know, I don't want to impress on people, but if you had a medical disease of some sort, like most people would go to the doctor and pray, like do both, So I always want to count that in because I don't want to write off, all the tools that we have or that we can have at our disposal if we ask for help.
That's so good. That's so good, Jeff. Well, you guys have written a couple books about this. I want to make sure that our community gets connected to these resources. And so one is Hope Lies Ahead. And that's kind of a lot of the story of your relationship together, this kind of wayward prodigal journey that you took, Jeff, what the Lord did to restore that, to bring that back, how you guys were able to reconcile and restore, and what's going on now, right? That's that book.
Yeah,
correct?
that's Hope Lies Ahead
And
is this
then
book.
Prayers for Prodigals.
Yeah, Prayers for
Awesome.
Hope Lies Ahead.
Awesome. And then Prayers
Jeff
for
and I
Prodigals.
wrote together as kind of a split screen of, kind of like what we've been doing now, as we've been sharing back and forth what was happening
Right.
on both sides. And it's kind of the backstory to this book, which came out earlier, Prayers for Prodigals. It's actually in a newer edition, but the cover is similar now. But this is a book of scripture-based prayers for people who love prodigals. And, we've seen God just do amazing things with that book. And, it's realizing now so much of what we went through. We've come into this place where we're, as we were talking about, able to help people, and we never would have gotten here if we hadn't been down these roads that are just heartbreaking. But the beautiful thing that we've learned is that God wastes nothing. He's able to take that road where you think, how could it ever come to this? How could we get here? And then all of a sudden, it's like the path comes out and you see the sunrise and you realize, okay, God has been able, I see him, I know him better, I'm closer to him. I don't want to be anywhere else. As long as I am where he is, it's going to be okay. And I think that is such a metaphor for life. And so, that's been a huge part of our journey, that God, we mentioned Jacob, but also Joseph, what he says to his brothers, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And, a lot of this is beyond us, why it happens, how it happens. Individual choice is such a huge part of it, and our own sinfulness. But, when we call Jesus Savior, there's reality to that identity that is breathtaking.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. That's amazing. Man. Well, guys, this has truly been a pleasure in hearing just a little bit. I feel like we just scratched the surface, and I could talk to you guys for hours about this. I wish we had the time to.
Yeah,
But,
sure.
man, it's just so good to see what the Lord is doing in your lives. And, Jeff, the ministry that you're carrying out through this story and this journey that you've walked, and then James, the ministry that you're doing on your own front as well, but also just the encouragement as a parent. I know we've got so many listeners, and even as a parent myself, where there's a lot of those questions that are swirling around. There's a lot of deconstruction, so to speak, that's going on in the lives of young adults right now. And so you're seeing some of these parents who are having some angst around that. And so I appreciate just the Christ-centered, spirit-filled conversation we've had right here. And it's really filled me up with hope. I know it's filled up so many of our listeners with hope as well. We'll make sure that we put on the show notes here where you guys can get connected with Jeff and with James and these resources. But man, guys, thanks so much for spending time with me. It's been awesome.
thank you, David.
Yeah, grateful to be with you, Davey. Thank you so much for having us on.
Thank you.
Hey friend, if you liked this episode, be sure to like and subscribe so that you can stay in the loop every time Nothing is Wasted releases a piece of content here on this YouTube channel.